There was a time when a single number could explain everything. $3.5 billion. Not just an investment, but a statement. A declaration that Dubai was no longer just a city of skyscrapers and luxury. It was becoming a global entertainment power. Dubai Parks and Resorts was never meant to be just a theme park. It was designed to prove something much bigger. That with enough capital, enough ambition, and enough vision, you could build an entire world from scratch and people would come to it. And for a while, they did. At its peak, this place felt like a living system of motion and sound. More than 2.6 million visitors passed through its gates in a single year. Families from Europe, tourists from Asia, workers from neighboring countries, all moving through the same space, and creating something that felt almost like a miniature version of the world itself. Music echoed through the streets, lights reflected off polished surfaces, and every corner seemed engineered to keep people engaged, spending, returning. It wasn't just entertainment. It was an ecosystem, because the real product wasn't the rides or the shows. It was the experience of being part of something global. A place where different cultures intersected, where consumption and identity blended into one seamless flow. In many ways, it resembled a modern Silk Road, not for goods, but for experiences. And that's what made it so powerful, because it didn't just rely on local demand. It relied on global movement, on the assumption that people would continue to travel, continue to spend, and continue to seek out new destinations that offered something bigger than what they already had. But that assumption carried a hidden risk, because when your entire system depends on constant inflow, even a small disruption can have amplified consequences. And then, almost without warning, the numbers stopped telling the same story. In just 24 hours, 80,000 bookings disappeared. Not gradually, not over months, but all at once. Resorts that were once filled with life suddenly stood quiet. Attractions that once operated at full capacity began to feel oversized, almost unnecessary. The system didn't collapse in a dramatic explosion. It emptied, and that emptiness revealed something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. The project had never just been about building something people needed. It had been about building something people were expected to want, and that difference matters more than it seems, because when demand is assumed rather than proven, it becomes fragile. It depends not on necessity, but on belief, on perception, on the idea that this place is worth choosing over all the other options in the world. For years, Dubai Parks and Resorts succeeded because it aligned with that belief. It matched the global narrative of growth, of expansion, of endless possibility. But once that narrative begins to weaken, even slightly, the system built on top of it begins to shift. What we are looking at now is not just a decline in visitors. It is the moment when an illusion starts to lose its power. Because the project didn't fail due to a single event. It failed because it was built on a very specific assumption. That scale alone could create sustainability. That if something was big enough, impressive enough, expensive enough, it would naturally succeed. But scale does not guarantee stability, and money does not guarantee meaning. Dubai Parks and Resorts was never just a business. It was an experiment, an attempt to manufacture demand on a global level, and for a while it worked. But now, standing in the silence of what was once one of the most ambitious entertainment projects in the world, a different question begins to emerge. Not whether it was impressive, not whether it was ambitious, but whether it was ever truly sustainable in the first place. At first, the change didn't look dramatic. There were no sudden closures, and no immediate signs of collapse that would make headlines overnight. If you walked through the park from a distance, the structures were still there. The colors hadn't faded. The architecture still carried the same bold confidence it always had. On the surface, nothing seemed broken. But if you stayed long enough, if you actually moved through the space instead of just looking at it, the difference became impossible to ignore. The emptiness wasn't hidden. It was everywhere. Rows of sun loungers stretched across the resort areas, untouched, baking under the desert heat. They didn't look like amenities anymore. They looked like markers. Silent, uniform, almost like something you'd see in a place that had been abandoned. There was a time when people would compete just to find a spot. When arriving late meant standing in line behind dozens of others. Now, there was no line, no competition, no urgency, just space. The pools, once filled with movement and noise, had become still. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful, but unnatural. Water that reflects the sky perfectly because nothing is disturbing it. No laughter, no splashes, no sense of life. And then there were the rides. Massive structures of steel that once represented speed, excitement, and technological achievement now stood frozen in place. Roller coasters that were designed to carry thousands of people each day had become motionless. From a distance, they almost resembled something prehistoric. Giant skeletons rising out of the sand, remnants of a time when something powerful once moved through them. It's a strange transformation, and domain online, because nothing physically changed. The rides didn't disappear, the buildings didn't collapse, the infrastructure is still intact, but the meaning of those structures has shifted completely. What was once a symbol of innovation now feels like a reminder of excess. What once represented progress now suggests overreach, and that's when the numbers start to make sense. A cumulative loss of over 8 billion AED isn't just a financial statistic. It's a reflection of something deeper. It's what happens when a system continues to operate at full scale without the demand to support it. Even the smallest details begin to take on new meaning. 60 million Lego bricks, once part of a vibrant attraction, now sit unused. Enough material to build an entire small town, reduced to silent decoration. Equipment worth billions of dollars continues to require maintenance, cooling, and protection from the harsh desert environment, even when it generates little to no return. Because large systems don't stop costing money just because they stop producing value. They continue to consume. Electricity still runs. Staff still maintain what they can. The desert still wears down surfaces with heat and dust. Every day that the system remains active without sufficient demand, the gap between cost and revenue grows wider. And that's the real shift. This is no longer a question of whether the park is popular or not. It's a question of whether the system itself still makes sense. Because when a project of this scale becomes empty, it doesn't just lose visitors, it loses its function. It becomes something else entirely, not a destination, not a business, but a symbol. A symbol of what happens when ambition moves faster than reality, when scale expands beyond what demand can sustain, when a vision designed for constant growth meets a moment where growth pauses, even briefly. And symbols are powerful, because they don't just represent themselves. They reflect larger patterns. The empty spaces here are not isolated. They are connected to decisions made years earlier, to assumptions about how people behave, how markets move, how global systems remain stable. What we are seeing is not just a quiet park, it is the visible outcome of invisible miscalculations. And once a place reaches that point, when its emptiness becomes more meaningful than its activity, it stops being just a location. It becomes a warning, not through dramatic collapse, but through silence. The kind of silence that forces you to ask a different kind of question. Not, what happened here? But, how did something this big become this empty? To answer that question, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the moment things started to decline, but to the moment everything was first imagined. Because long before the empty seats and silent rides, there was a blueprint. In 2012, Dubai Parks and Resorts was introduced as part of a much larger vision. It wasn't just about building an amusement destination. It was about transforming the entire economic identity of the region. The goal was ambitious: attract 20 million tourists annually, diversify beyond oil, and position Dubai as a global hub not just for business but for entertainment. And the plan was bold. An entire entertainment continent spread across 25 million square feet. Multiple parks, international franchises, immersive experiences, all placed in a location that, until recently, had been little more than desert. It was an attempt to do something few places had ever tried: to replicate the success of global entertainment capitals like Orlando, in one of the harshest climates on Earth. And at first glance, it seemed possible, because Dubai had already proven something important, that it could build what others couldn't. Skyscrapers that defied expectation, islands shaped like continents, infrastructure that connected the world. There was a growing belief that with enough resources, any limitation could be engineered away. But that belief contained a hidden flaw, and for it assumed that physical constraints were the only constraints that mattered. And that's where the first major miscalculation begins. Because while buildings can be engineered, behavior cannot. The design of the parks relied heavily on open spaces, wide plazas connecting attractions, outdoor walkways guiding visitors from one experience to another. It created a sense of scale, of openness, of grandeur. But it also created exposure. Exposure to a climate that regularly reaches 45 degrees Celsius. In theory, this might not seem like a critical issue. Visitors could move between shaded areas. They could plan around peak heat hours. The experience could still function. But in reality, comfort is not negotiable. When people travel for leisure, they don't optimize for endurance. They optimize for ease, for convenience, for environments that allow them to relax, not adapt. And this is where the design begins to work against itself. In the summer months, which represent a significant portion of the year, the park effectively limits its own usability. Walking between attractions becomes exhausting. Outdoor queues become unbearable. The very scale that was meant to impress begins to feel like a burden, and yet the system continues to operate. Maintenance costs don't decrease because fewer people are visiting. Cooling systems still run. Staff are still required. Infrastructure still demands attention, so the project enters a dangerous dynamic. High fixed costs combined with fluctuating demand, and that combination is difficult to sustain over time. But climate wasn't the only factor. There was another assumption embedded into the model: that international tourists would consistently make up the majority of visitors. In fact, up to 70% of expected revenue depended on people traveling from outside the region. At first, this made sense. Dubai was already a global destination. Its airport connected continents. Its brand attracted attention. But reliance on international visitors introduces a different kind of vulnerability, because international demand is not stable. It depends on global conditions, on economic confidence, on geopolitical stability, on travel convenience, on factors that exist far beyond the control of any single city. And when you build a system that depends on those external variables, you're not just building a business, you're building exposure. Exposure to everything you cannot control. That's what makes this design so fragile. Not because it was poorly constructed, but because it was constructed under ideal assumptions. Assumptions that people would behave in certain ways, that global movement would remain uninterrupted, that comfort could be managed rather than prioritized. That demand would continue simply because the offering was impressive, and for a while, those assumptions held. But over time, small cracks begin to appear, not as failures, but as friction. Visitors coming less frequently during certain months, spending less time inside the park, choosing alternative experiences that offer similar entertainment with greater comfort, and those small changes accumulate, because systems of this scale don't fail suddenly. They erode, gradually, quietly, until one day the gap between expectation and reality becomes too large to ignore. And when that happens, but what once felt like a bold vision begins to reveal itself as something else, a design that didn't fail because it was too ambitious, but because it misunderstood the conditions it was built in. Because in the end, the most important factor was never the size of the investment. It was the environment, both physical and behavioral, that the system had to operate within. And that environment was never as controllable as it first appeared. And if the design miscalculation was the first crack, the next failure ran even deeper. Because building something impressive is one thing, making people feel connected to it is something else entirely. That was the promise behind Bollywood Parks. On paper, it looked like a perfect idea. A theme park dedicated to one of the largest film industries in the world, placed inside a city where South Asians make up a significant portion of the population. The logic seemed straightforward: a built-in audience, a powerful cultural identity, a concept that should have translated naturally into demand. But that assumption overlooked something critical. Presence is not the same as participation. Just because a community exists in a place doesn't mean it will engage with a product designed around its culture. Especially when that product is positioned in a way that doesn't match how that community actually lives. Bollywood Parks was built as a premium experience. Ticket prices reached around 300 AED, roughly $80. For a tourist visiting once, this might seem acceptable, but for the very audience it was supposed to resonate with, the working and middle-class South Asian population, this wasn't entertainment. It was a barrier. For many, that price represented a week's worth of living expenses. A single visit required a level of spending that simply didn't align with everyday reality. And when entertainment competes with necessity, necessity always wins. At the same time, alternatives existed. Just a short distance away, places like Global Village offered similar cultural experiences at a fraction of the cost. Food, performances, social atmosphere, all accessible, all familiar, all affordable. And that difference changed everything. Because people don't just choose based on what's available. They choose based on what feels right, what fits their habits, their expectations, their economic reality. Bollywood Parks, despite its scale and investment, didn't fit. It felt disconnected. Not because the concept was wrong, but because the execution misunderstood the relationship between culture and consumption. Culture cannot simply be packaged and sold back to the people it comes from, especially when it's priced beyond their reach. And when that disconnect becomes clear, the result isn't gradual decline, it's absence. The theaters designed for large audiences sat empty. The immersive experiences, built with advanced technology, operated without the crowds they were meant to serve. The energy that was supposed to define the space never fully materialized, and eventually, the outcome became unavoidable. In April 2023, Bollywood Parks closed, not temporarily, permanently. The dream that once seemed so strategically sound had collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions. But what happened next reveals something even more important. And instead of stepping back and reassessing the model, the response was to rebrand. The space was transformed into Real Madrid World, a globally recognized name, a powerful sports brand, a new attempt to attract attention and revive interest. On the surface, it looked like a fresh start, but underneath, very little had changed. The infrastructure remained the same. The rides were repurposed, repainted, relabeled. The experience was adjusted, but not fundamentally redesigned. And visitors noticed, because people can sense when something is authentic, and when something is layered on top of an existing structure without changing its core. The excitement didn't return in the way it was expected to, because branding can attract attention, but it cannot create meaning. And meaning is what sustains long-term engagement. Even the details began to reinforce the disconnect. High service prices remained. A bottle of water costing 25 AED in the middle of the desert didn't feel like premium positioning. It felt like exploitation. It widened the gap between the experience being offered and the reality people were willing to accept. So the rebranding didn't solve the problem. It exposed it further, because what it revealed was not a failure of theme, but a failure of understanding. The project was built on the idea that demand could be engineered through scale, through branding, through association with globally recognized names. But demand is not created that way. It emerges from alignment between product and audience, between pricing and behavior, between experience and expectation. Without that alignment, even the most impressive concepts struggle to survive. And that's the deeper lesson here. The failure of Bollywood Parks wasn't just about pricing or positioning. It was about the assumption that culture could be transformed into a commodity without losing its connection to the people it represents. Because once that connection is lost, what remains is not culture, it's imitation. And imitation, no matter how well-funded, rarely holds attention for long. So what we're seeing is not just the closure of a theme park, it's the collapse of a cultural illusion. The belief that identity can be imported, repackaged, and sold at scale without understanding the reality it comes from. And once that illusion breaks, it leaves behind something much harder to fix than empty buildings. It leaves behind a question. If people don't feel connected to what you build, then who is it really for? And once that question starts to surface, the numbers begin to tell a story that can no longer be ignored. Because behind every empty seat, every silent ride, every failed rebranding effort, there is a financial structure holding everything together, or, in this case, slowly coming apart. For years, the expectation was simple. Build at scale, attract at scale, profit at scale. The logic seemed sound. Large investments would create large attractions. Large attractions would draw global visitors, and those visitors would generate enough revenue to justify the initial cost. It was a model that relied on momentum. As long as growth continued, the system could sustain itself. But what happens when growth slows, even slightly? That's where the numbers begin to shift. By 2021, the cumulative losses had reached more than 8.16 billion AED, a figure so large it's difficult to fully grasp. This wasn't a temporary setback. It wasn't a bad quarter or a seasonal fluctuation. It was a structural imbalance. Revenue had collapsed. In a single year, it dropped by 71%. Visitor numbers, once at 2.6 million, fell to just over 800,000. The difference isn't just a decline, it's a breakdown of the assumptions that supported the entire model. Because the system wasn't designed for variability. It was designed for consistency. High visitor numbers, continuous inflow, stable demand. Remove those conditions, and the structure begins to strain. At the same time, the costs remained fixed. Massive infrastructure doesn't scale down when demand decreases. Maintenance continues. Staff costs persist. Cooling systems operate regardless of how many people walk through the gates. The desert climate doesn't pause its effects just because fewer visitors are present. And then there's the debt. More than 5.2 billion AED in net debt, sitting over the operation like a constant pressure point. Interest doesn't wait. It accumulates. It compounds. Every day the system fails to generate sufficient revenue, the burden grows heavier. This creates a dangerous dynamic. The project cannot easily stop operating because shutting down would lock in losses and damage investor confidence. But continuing to operate without demand accelerates financial strain. It becomes a cycle. Operate to survive, spend to maintain, lose to continue, and over time, that cycle becomes unsustainable. But perhaps the most revealing number isn't the loss or the debt. It's the depreciation. In a single fiscal year, assets lost 1.7 billion AED in value. That means the very things that were once considered the core of the investment, the rides, the infrastructure, the physical experience, are no longer worth what they were assumed to be. And that's a critical shift, because it signals a change in perception, not just from the public, but from the investors themselves. It's an acknowledgement that what was built does not hold the value it was expected to, that the market, ultimately, has its own judgment, and that judgment cannot be controlled by scale, by branding, or by narrative. It is based on demand, real demand, not projected demand, not assumed demand, but actual, sustained interest from people willing to spend. And when that demand falls short, even the most impressive assets begin to lose meaning. They become liabilities, structures that require constant input without generating proportional output. That's when the system begins to change at a deeper level. Investors start to reconsider, not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly. Capital that once flowed easily becomes more cautious. New projects face greater scrutiny. Expansion plans are delayed or adjusted. Confidence doesn't disappear all at once. It fades. And as it fades, the system that relied on it begins to slow. This is what transforms a business problem into something larger. Because once financial imbalance becomes visible, it affects more than just one project. It influences how the entire model is perceived. If one large-scale development struggles under its own weight, questions begin to emerge about others. Are they sustainable? Are they dependent on the same assumptions? Are they exposed to the same risks? And that's how a single project becomes a signal, not just of its own failure, but of a potential weakness in the broader system. Because when a model is built on continuous expansion, it doesn't need to collapse to reveal its limits. It only needs to slow down. And once it does, everything built on top of that momentum has to adjust. What we are seeing here is not just financial loss, it is the cost of misalignment between scale and demand, between expectation and reality, between what was built and what people were actually willing to sustain. And when that gap becomes too large, no amount of investment can close it. Because money can build the system, but it cannot force people to use it. And yet, even with all of those internal weaknesses, the design flaws, the cultural disconnect, the financial imbalance, the system might have continued to hold together a little longer, because fragile systems don't always collapse on their own. Sometimes they need a trigger. And in 2026, that trigger arrived, not from within the park, not from a failed marketing campaign or a seasonal downturn, but from something far more powerful and far more uncontrollable: geopolitics. For years, Dubai had built its global reputation on one core promise: stability. In a region often associated with volatility, it positioned itself as the exception, a safe zone, a neutral ground where business, tourism, and lifestyle could flourish without interruption. That promise was more valuable than any ride, any hotel, any brand. Because safety is the foundation of everything else. Without it, luxury becomes irrelevant. Entertainment becomes optional. Travel becomes a risk rather than a choice. And then, almost suddenly, that foundation was shaken. On the 28th of February 2026, events in the region escalated in a way that could no longer be ignored. What had once felt distant, something happening elsewhere, something abstract, became immediate, real. When black smoke rose near Jebel Ali, just miles away from the parks, it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a signal that the boundary between perception and reality had shifted. Because Dubai's greatest asset had always been its ability to separate itself from regional instability, to create the feeling that whatever was happening outside its borders would not affect what was happening inside. But in that moment, that separation began to blur, and once that happens, perception changes instantly. Tourists don't analyze geopolitical complexity. They respond to risk. Even the possibility of danger is enough to alter behavior. Families reconsider trips. Travelers cancel plans. Insurance warnings increase. Airlines adjust routes. And in a system built on constant inflow, those reactions matter immediately. Within days, more than 80,000 bookings were canceled. Not because the parks themselves had changed, but because the context around them had. And context is everything. Because an experience that feels safe and exciting one week can feel uncertain and unnecessary the next. The rides didn't stop working. The hotels didn't disappear. The infrastructure remained intact. But the reason people came in the first place, confidence, began to fade. And once confidence disappears, demand follows. The closure that followed in early March wasn't just a temporary operational decision, it was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that the system could not function under these conditions, because the model had always assumed a stable environment. It had been built on that assumption, and when that assumption was no longer guaranteed, everything connected to it became vulnerable. Even the airport, Dubai's most critical connection to the world, was affected. When airspace disruptions forced closures and rerouting, the city itself became harder to access, not permanently, but enough to break the sense of seamless connectivity that defined it, and that disruption carries a different weight compared to other types of crises. Because there is no clear timeline, no defined recovery path, no guarantee of when normal conditions will return. That uncertainty lingers, and uncertainty is difficult for systems like this to absorb, because they depend on predictability. On people planning ahead, on companies making long-term investments, on tourists committing to future trips. When the future becomes unclear, those decisions are delayed. And when enough decisions are delayed at the same time, the system slows. What's important to understand is that this event didn't create the weakness. It exposed it, all the vulnerabilities that had been building quietly over time, the reliance on international visitors, the dependence on perception, the financial pressure, the design limitations, were already there. The geopolitical shock simply made them visible. It accelerated what might have taken years to unfold under normal conditions. And that's what makes this moment so significant, because it reveals the difference between resilience and dependence. A resilient system can absorb shocks and continue functioning. A dependent system requires specific conditions to operate, and when those conditions change, even temporarily, the entire structure begins to struggle. That's what we're seeing now, not the sudden collapse of a perfect system, but the exposure of a system that was always more fragile than it appeared. A system that worked exceptionally well under the right circumstances, but those circumstances were never guaranteed. And once they shifted, even slightly, the illusion of control began to dissolve. Because in the end, no matter how advanced the infrastructure, no matter how large the investment, no matter how carefully the experience is designed, there are forces that cannot be engineered away. And when those forces enter the equation, they don't just affect the surface. They reach into the core of how the system functions, and they force it to answer a question it was never designed to face. What happens when the conditions you depend on no longer exist? And once that question is asked, it doesn't stay contained within a single project, because what we are looking at is no longer just the story of a theme park. It's the story of a model. A way of building cities, economies, and entire identities around a very specific idea. That perception can drive reality. That if something looks successful enough, feels impressive enough, is large enough and visible enough, it will sustain itself. For years, that idea worked. Dubai became one of the clearest examples of how powerful perception can be. A city where growth was visible, where ambition was tangible, where every new project reinforced the same message. This is the future, and it is already here. But perception is not the same as foundation, and that distinction becomes critical when conditions change. Dubai's system is unique in one important way. Nearly 88% of its population consists of foreigners, people who are there by choice, not by deep-rooted connection. Professionals, workers, investors, families, each one making a decision to stay based on opportunity, safety, and quality of life. That creates flexibility, but it also creates fragility, because when circumstances shift, even slightly, those same people can choose to leave. And when enough of them do, the impact is immediate. This is already beginning to show, not in dramatic headlines, but in patterns. Real estate in areas surrounding large developments begins to soften. Properties that were once marketed as the future of urban living now face slower demand. Projects that relied on long-term growth projections encounter short-term hesitation. The change is subtle, but it spreads, because confidence operates in layers. At the top, you have global investors. At the middle, you have professionals and businesses. At the base, you have workers and service providers. Each layer responds differently, but all are connected. When confidence weakens at one level, it eventually reaches the others. That's what makes the current situation so important, because it raises a question that goes beyond Dubai parks and resorts. It challenges the logic of the mega-project model itself. Large-scale developments that require billions in investment, years of planning, and continuous demand are inherently difficult to adjust. They are built to operate under specific conditions. When those conditions change, they cannot easily scale down. They become rigid, and rigidity in a changing environment is a problem because it limits adaptability. It turns assets into burdens. Structures that once symbolized growth begin to resemble what economists call white elephants, projects that are impressive in appearance but costly to maintain and difficult to justify economically. And when multiple projects begin to show similar patterns, the question becomes larger, not whether a single development can recover, but whether the model that produced it is still viable. Because a model built on external demand, tourism, international investment, global movement, depends on a stable, predictable world. And the world is becoming less predictable, more interconnected, but also more sensitive to disruption. That doesn't mean the model fails entirely, but it does mean it faces limits. Limits that were not as visible during periods of uninterrupted growth. What we are seeing now is the point where those limits begin to surface, where the gap between appearance and reality narrows, where the cost of maintaining the image begins to outweigh the benefits it produces, and that's when systems begin to evolve. Not always by choice, sometimes by necessity. Dubai is unlikely to disappear. Cities like this rarely do. They adapt, they restructure, they find new ways to remain relevant. But the version of Dubai that was built on the assumption of endless acceleration, that version is being tested, because the conditions that supported it are no longer as certain. And that changes the trajectory. It forces a transition, from expansion to evaluation, from building more to sustaining what already exists, from relying on perception to reinforcing foundation. And that transition is not unique to Dubai. It reflects a broader shift in how modern cities operate. Because across the world, similar models are facing similar questions. How much growth is sustainable? How dependent should a system be on external factors? What happens when global movement slows, even temporarily? These are not easy questions, and they don't have immediate answers, but they define the next phase. Because what we are witnessing is not just the decline of a project, it is the exposure of a philosophy. A philosophy that believed scale could replace stability. That visibility could replace resilience. That ambition, on its own, could guarantee success. And now, standing in the silence of what was once a symbol of that philosophy, a different understanding begins to take shape. That growth has limits, that perception has boundaries, and that even the most impressive systems must eventually confront the conditions they were built in. Dubai Parks and Resorts now stands as more than just an empty destination. It is a reflection of what happens when a system reaches the edge of its assumptions, and what comes next will not be defined by how large the next project is, but by how well the system adapts to a world that is no longer as predictable as it once was. Because in the end, the question is no longer about whether something can be built, it is about whether it can endure. And that is a much harder challenge to solve.